A room without books is like a body without a soul.
Hello and welcome again to Sundoku, the podcast for anyone who has a bed overshadowed by a towering pile of books. I'm Sarah Martin.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. And it's Nazi Germany and the mean streets of Sydney today, a couple of tough stories. I'll be interviewing well-decorated short story writer Michael Caleb Tasker about his first novel, Just Like the Night, and finding out how he knows so much about cheating at cards and the connection between crime noir and existentialism. And Sarah, you've talked to...
I talked to Elisabeth Storr. She's an avid historical fiction writer, and she's spoken to me about her new novel, Fables and Lies, which, as you mentioned, is set in the heart of Nazi Germany in World War II, but inspired by Priam's treasure, which was the gold discovered in Troy.
Well, I'm about to do a deep dive into Troy, having just seen the Odyssey and realising I don't know the story. So that's a nice little connection, yes.
It's lovely, and it's wonderful to hear how one idea that you think is sort of almost unrelated to a topic can take you into a whole new world.
She wrote something about ancient Rome as well, didn't she?
Yes, she wrote a Tale of Ancient Rome trilogy. So she's gone into that world, which I think is where she discovered Priam's treasure, and then she sort of discovered its connection to museums within Berlin, and that's how the story moves.
Okay, we'll hear from her later, but first to Just Like the Night. It's Michael Caleb Tasker's first novel, but he comes to the literary scene well decorated with awards, including he won the 2019 Saturday Evening Post Great American Fiction Contest. That's pretty cool. He's also had a richly diverse life between Canada, America and Australia. He's got a PhD in the medieval roots of existential fiction, and yet he's worked in all sorts of real-world jobs. Well, academia is not quite the real world, but journalism, and he's even been a ranch hand. And he currently manages an art supply shop in Adelaide. So the kind of background that you would imagine yields rich stories and fodder for the imagination. And as you'll hear in this interview, Mike was a man who takes his writing very seriously. No crime novel templates for him. And this novel, Just Like the Night, deals with a truly dark side of life. I asked him to explain the plot.
It starts off in America. Sarah has spent her childhood following her father around highways, byways of rural America mostly, and small towns, and sitting in or in back rooms during rigged poker games, essentially, and small cons, that kind of a thing. But the things start to go a bit pear-shaped, and they run off to Australia when Sarah is 12 to hide and try and start over.
It's an interesting world that most people are not familiar with, the world of someone who just has to make their money by being clever.
Right.
Tell me about Ray. Ray has got a lot of skills, but they all seem to be used in the wrong direction.
Yeah, a failed magician, essentially, who does have a knack for reading people and obviously a bit of a hard streak through him, even though he's a good person. And he shuns the potential limelight of a magician's life, and for one reason or another, it's more backstory than the novel goes into. He's wound up basically a petty criminal, getting by on his wits and his sleight of hand magician work.
And having these amazing games where he's reading everybody, he's able to do clever things with the cards that no one notices.
Yeah.
All those little details are slipped into this story.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating world to enter into. Where did your fascination with it begin?
Probably more with the magic end of things, and when I'm using terminology in the book during card games and dealing with movements and such, it stems more from magic than it does from actual poker most of the time. Sleight of hand, card tricks, that kind of a thing. I know more about magic than I do about poker as well. But I know a bit about poker. I'm not very good at it. Also not very good at magic. But
it fascinates you.
Yes. Yeah, there are some interesting stories, some of which I stole for the book. There's a very well-known magician called Dai Vernon, D-A-I, Vernon. He actually spent some time on the road. He walked away from his career for a brief period to hunt down a gambler who he had heard could deal from the middle of a deck, which seems impossible to me. And top is the obvious one. a fast man can deal from the bottom without anyone noticing. I don't know how you deal from the middle, but apparently there was a gambler who actually could deal from the middle of the deck. And this magician, Dave Vernon, spent some time trying to track him down so he could learn how to do that, and was successful. And then he went back to his magic life, and the gambler apparently ended up in jail and then dead.
Okay, so Ray's more on that track.
Yeah.
So Ray ends up in Australia, and we've gathered that maybe he had to go as far away as possible from the life that he lived in America, which was basically motel rooms with his daughter, setting up games, cheating, winning big, very cleverly.
Yeah.
So there they are in Australia, and in your book, we then moved to Sarah grown up, 30 years later, just out of jail.
Yes. Yeah.
Set that scene.
How much can I give away? All of it?
No, don't give all of it away.
Okay. She's middle-aged and just released from 8 years in prison, or 8.5 years in prison. And that's essentially when most of the current action of the novel starts, and she tries to reconnect with her incredibly immoral daughter, who's in her early 20s by the time Sarah is out of prison.
So Sarah, without giving too much away, has kind of ended up in prison because of the mother-daughter relationship.
Very much so, yeah.
And now she gets tangled up again. Sarah's, her daughter, Lena, is mixed up at the bad end of town in Sydney, and we get a lot of life in the mean streets, the underbelly of Sydney. Yeah.
So Sarah and her father, once they got to Australia, her father was pretty much clean. And Sarah got entangled in a few sort of small, petty, lightweight things, you might say, but her daughter was, as she grew, was drawn into the more sinister side of the criminal underworld, the more, morbid and deathly side. She had no moral compass. She had no ethically decent bone in her body, and Sarah tries to contend with the fact that her daughter turned out like that, and to what level is she responsible, and how far should she go to protect her daughter, or try and retrieve her daughter from this underworld.
And so the adventure begins. It's quite nail-biting. She goes to see Ray, who's now an old man.
Yep.
From time to time. Ray's kind of the moral compass almost for her, because even though, he's a baddie, he's been ripping people off all his life.
Yeah.
He's a good man, isn't he?
Yeah, he has his very clear ethical boundaries. He'll do a card game where he knows everyone is in on it, so to speak. Everyone's aware of the fact that it might be a rigged game. It's other criminals playing other criminals, so he'll do something like that and put himself in jeopardy. But he also has his lines of where he will and won't go, which are very strong lines. He tries to pass that on to Sarah, and Sarah, in her own way, she, if she had not been brought up in that world with her father, if she had not been grown up in an environment of crime, she wouldn't have been a criminal. She's not that kind of person, but because she grew up in that world, that's the only world that she knew, she ends up towing the waters there.
What brought you to the character of Sarah?
The original concept was just someone trying to get their life in order after being released from prison. And then everything else grew around it. The father, the daughter, the whole world then grew around that. Do
you remember the moment that you decided that it was something that you were interested in? Like, how do you get your life together after prison?
I don't. I get too many ideas, and I write everything down. Eventually I go through them, and some of them stick, some of them linger, some of them fade away, some of them I look at in my notebooks after some time has passed, whether it's a week or a year, and they're just terrible ideas, and some are decent. And this was one of the decent ones I thought that I could work with and I wanted to work with, and I just built on that.
Now, you've done a lot of short story writing. You've
Yes.
done journalism. You've also done a PhD, which we'll get to shortly, on a fascinating topic.
Yeah.
This is a novel. It's
Yes.
a new form for you.
Yes.
What brought you to that?
I've written and published 50 or so short stories, I think. Started a while ago, and a lot of it going to the novel was just a matter of word count. When I started writing short stories years ago, the anthologies and such would publish longer short stories where your average word count was, say, 3,000, 3,500. And most of my stories were over 5,000, but they could still squeeze in. They'd still take the longer story because it wasn't too different. But now, over the years, word count in these anthologies has shrunk down to 1,000 or 2,000 words, by and large, not always. And at the same time, my own word count for a short story started to bump up to about 10,000, which was way too long.
So you were heading for the novel.
Yeah. And there was a few ideas that I had in there that couldn't go with in a short story. They needed more space, more breathing room to develop. Even just setting the scene of Ray and his card sharp world, like going from magician to card sharp, couldn't really do that with enough room in a short story. And that's just one small aspect of the novel, very small aspect compared to Sarah's whole trajectory. You couldn't do that in a short story at all.
So when you have that freedom of just keep writing and see how it goes, is it a moving process getting to know your characters as you write?
Well, before I start writing, I usually have a good idea of, in this case, the three main characters. So the characters are pretty firmly established already in my mind, at least, before I start writing. But it's the plot and the story itself that I'm more flexible with. I don't write a plot outline or anything. I sort of have maybe 3 to 5 signpost issues or scenes that I want to hit, but otherwise that's pretty free-flowing.
Are you going to go back to short stories, or have you got another novel?
I'm working currently on another novel. See how that goes.
And a satisfying project.
Oh, yeah.
And do you write every day? What's your routine?
Pretty much. Right now, it's been a bit scattered, but for most of my life, it's been a writing life, I should say. It's been, I wake up around 4 a.m, write until about 7:30, get my daughter up, get her to school, go to work, and then once the day is ended and daughter's in bed and that kind of things late at night, I'll do a bit of editing or note-taking or thinking or something like that. So the writing is usually...
Truly dedicated writer.
Yeah, and that's almost every day, but not quite. I'll take days off for holidays, that kind of thing.
Let's go to your PhD, because it's a fascinating topic, the medieval roots of existentialist noir, modern existentialist noir writing. Yeah. Tell me about that.
That ended up, long process obviously, but that ended up mostly existentialism, Kierkegaard, and noir fiction from the 30s to the 80s, ending sort of with John D. MacDonald, who wrote the Travis McGee series. He's a wonderful writer. But some of the medieval stuff early on, I was just looking at how medieval adventure stories and noir both have in common, even though they're dressed up as adventure or crime or something, they're really about, as I see it, about a very existential search for meaning to give your life a purpose. And then it went on to look at Kierkegaard's understanding of alienation and despair. It was heavily on Kierkegaard. A little bit of the others, but I find him to be the most sensible. You can understand what he's saying. You know, obviously there's translation issues, but he says things in a much more specific manner than, say, Jean-Paul Sartre, who people look at with existentialism, but there's just too much Sartre. He just changes his thoughts too much over his career, I guess you'd call it. It's hard to get concrete on him, and there's too many interpretations by different people on Sartre. It got nonsensical.
That connection between noir writing, existentialist noir writing, to me, when I either see or read noir, I feel it's very bleak. Yeah. So it's about the search for meaning, but they seem to not find the meaning.
Yeah, I think that's the anxiety issue. Kierkegaard talks a lot about anxiety. The anxiety issue is what gives it what you might see as a meaningless tension throughout the book, the pure chaos of life. That's really brought home in existentialism.
So Raymond Chandler's one of your...
Yeah, there's too many to name. But I love Raymond Chandler. We were talking about this before. With a lot of them, Raymond Chandler, John D. MacDonald, Westlake, a lot of them will write what is ostensibly a crime novel, i.e. Chandler's The Long Goodbye, which is a brilliant and beautiful book. And it's in theory a murder mystery, a detective story. But as I see it, that's very thin. That's very secondary to the storyline, which is all about Marlowe, his detective, Chandler's detective Marlowe, struggling with his own place in the world, his loneliness, and wanting a friendship with Lennox, but not getting it. Things don't work out. The crime ends up being solved and working on that level, but the friendship doesn't work out. The life doesn't work out, so to speak. It's not tied up neatly, and I think that's what gives that sort of chaotic meaninglessness, what some people might call the atmosphere of noir, of what the hell is going on in this world. Even though the murder was solved, all of the major plot points were not solved, and the major plot points have nothing to do with crime.
So it's about people.
Exactly.
The deep the search for meaning, the deep
Yeah.
things that go on inside people.
Yeah.
Is that something like you've written so many short stories, you've been decorated for your short stories? Is that a topic that you constantly come back to yourself?
Not intentionally. I think it seeps in a lot of the time. More interested in, I think, just having a character in a situation, seeing how that evolves in different ways, whether it's a relationship not working out or somebody having a nervous breakdown, something not working out with family or something like that. But then I think that a lot of those tenets of existentialism, whether it's anxiety or despair or alienation, they do end up working their way in just...
As you're talking, I'm going back to your book, because really that's what we're looking at there,
Yeah.
aren't we? There's the search for meaning, this Ray at the end of his life, having spent his life cheating people.
Yeah.
You know, it is the same. We're inside those characters. It's more about them than it is about the plot, even though the plot races along.
Yeah, good. I'm glad to hear it. Good.
When did you start writing then? What's inspired you to write?
Very first little bit of writing I did was in grade 5. I was in a class of only 4 or 5 students, and we got shunted into a grade 6 class, and therefore we were forgotten about due to the numbers. And me and a friend wrote terribly violent 80s action movie knockoffs. Never went anywhere. And then I didn't do much until university. My final year of university, I think I took a short story writing class with MJ Highland, Australian writer. And she was really encouraging. And then I sort of pittered around for a little bit until my mid-20s is when I started to take it seriously. I went to UTS, did my master's degree. And obviously for some of those courses I had to do several short stories. A lot were terrible. 1 or 2 were really good. And probably the biggest encouragement I had there was one of my teachers was the late Jean Bedford, who was just a wonderful teacher and a wonderful lady. Her and her husband, Peter Corris, they both read one of my works that I did for one of her classes, and both of them were really encouraging. It ended up getting published and winning an award. And that sort of got me on the track to think, okay, maybe I can do this decently.
Fantastic. Just before we get you to read something from your book, I just wanted to ask you, the word noir gets thrown around a fair bit these days, and we've got all this rural noir. I think it's the term for it. We've got those books pouring out every Christmas. Everybody seems to go to a writing class and learn how to write a thriller.
Yeah.
Do you think they deserve the moniker noir after what you've been talking about?
I don't know, because I don't read many of them.
They always seem to me to be quite formulaic.
Yeah.
Begin with the body and end with a sort of some kind of resolution.
Yeah, it's probably not as I see it, but then there are different definitions of noir. But I haven't read too much of them. There's an American called Michael Ferris Smith. I don't know how to classify him. He's literary noir, perhaps, or Ron Rash as well. But again, they're peculiar. They're more on the literary side with a touch of crime, or Walter Mosley and James Lee Burke. Walter Mosley, definitely. He's still doing noir as I see noir. He's a fantastic writer. But I'm probably a bit remiss in my reading. I don't...
You've got a lot of writing to do, so...
Yeah. yeah. And I don't actually read a heap of crime. I tend to read more literary fiction, as it were. Big Jim Harrison fan, John Steinbeck. Willa Cather is just amazing. I just finished again for the second time The Song of the Lark. I just can't believe how good that book is. The Song of the Lark.
No, I don't know.
So good.
We'll put that on our recommended list. I sense that you're fascinated by what makes good and what makes evil, and how often that can be quite structural. Particularly the idea of the prison, the coming out of prison, the not being able to get a foothold, the turning back to the old tricks, that sort of idea.
Yeah.
So is good and evil a fascination for you?
I don't know if on that broad scope good and evil comes to mind, but on the smaller day-to-day level, I'm definitely interested in our choices, our responsibilities, the consequences of our choices. The fact that, like if you tell a lie or two here and there, maybe you're not a terrible person, but if you start to tell more and more, it gets easier and easier, and it builds up until you're essentially a pathological liar. And I think I mentioned this off mic, but how too many lies can apparently actually alter your brain chemistry, which is a terrifying and fascinating thought, but that means it's changing who you are as a human being, just small little choices. Very existential in terms of creating yourself, so to speak. One of the ideas of existentialism, which I don't fully agree with, is that you create who you are in all of your actions, as opposed to having a ready-made being. But Kierkegaard would have disagreed with that, and he's the father of existentialism, so we'll go with him.
Well, let's go back to your very readable book, Just Like the
Thank
Night, and I'll get you to read a passage.
Okay. It was quiet without a cellmate. Some nights Sarah could hear the wind outside breaking against the trees. It was a hollow sound, and distant, like it still had a long way to go. It was better in winter. Everything was. The moon was closer, so that the tired light filled her cell and made it look clean, and the damp didn't leak from the walls. And the bats were calmer. The new girl still cried, slow, smothered cries that stopped with a sudden hiss, a snake bite from a cellmate, and left the air empty. Sarah listened to the wind, and she wanted to sleep with a window open again, feel the cold night on her skin and smell the smoke from the fires over in the mountains. Her body clock was out of whack on the inside. It had been since the start. She was asleep early, before lights out, even when she had cellmates. She slept through all the voices and the methadone-spiked fights, and every now and then a hard beating that shut the whole place down. But she was up early, before the sun, face washed, push-ups done, and bed made, waiting like there was something to wait for. Her father had been like that when they first came over to Australia when she was 12, left the States behind and tried to start over. He couldn't get into it. He couldn't relax, couldn't find a rhythm. Something always lingered. It was like some kind of jet lag he didn't want to get over.
Michael, thank you very
Thank
much
you
for coming.
Thank you for having me.
And all the best with the book.
Thank you very much.
Michael Caleb Tasker, author of Just Like the Night. You just heard a little excerpt of it there. It's on the bookshelves now, and it's published by Allen and Unwin. And one important thing, Sarah, that I gleaned from that interview was the discovery of a genre that was new to me. Maybe I'm a bit sheltered. Literary noir. I know about literary non-fiction, but I didn't know about literary noir. I get it completely. And I think a topic we should explore sometime on Sundoku would be the growing list of literary genres.
Oh, yes, because there are so many. It seems like they're emerging all of the time, and you're like, what exactly does that mean? And then you put the words together and think about it a bit, and it makes some sense. You're listening to Sundoku, the podcast for truly addicted readers. So now on to Fables and Lies. It's a massive tome of a book, but it's worth it. It's set in the heart of Nazi Germany in World War II, written by author Elisabeth Storrs, who is an absolute history fanatic. Historical fiction, but the depth of research is amazing. Elisabeth has got herself access to journals and archives of some of the characters that were real humans living in this time to really give the story weight and understand it.
And don't you love reading fiction that is well historically researched, because it takes you right back there. You learn so much.
Oh, absolutely. And it's really interesting because in talking to Elisabeth, and you'll hear some more through the interview, she was telling me about how she'd almost been told that World War II doesn't have an audience anymore. But the amount of things, even having grown and known and read so much about that time and about the experience of Nazi Germany, I learned so much more and was reminded of so much more. I think there's a salience in revisiting a topic, particularly one so important as what happened in World War II, time and time again. And so authors bringing that story back, I feel like it's really valuable.
And it sounds like this shines a light on a different part of it too. So you're getting a different angle each time, a different way of looking at the topic.
It certainly does. It follows the story of a family living within Berlin, a German family. So, and their connections to the SS, but some of them are all in, and others are a bit concerned about what's going on around them. But it also explains, how protected they were from the real story through propaganda. It also connects into the cultural heritage and how museums and curators were trying to hold on to treasures and those kind of aspects of what was in Berlin and also just around Berlin, and how they were how archaeologists and historians were also rewriting history. So there's just so many strands within this story that it's fascinating the whole way through. Anyway, when I started speaking to Elisabeth, I thought it was interesting to start with the very curious way that she found her way into this story.
I was obsessed with the story of Heinrich Schliemann finding Priam's treasure at Troy. He was a German archaeologist who discovered Troy, proved that it existed, and also found this amazing cache of jewellery there. And when I followed that story through, he was a bit of a rogue as well as a genius. He ended up smuggling that treasure out to Germany, and he bequeathed it to the German people in perpetuity, and it ended up in a museum of pre- and early history in Berlin, which was actually situated next to the Gestapo headquarters, which was another little tidbit that I discovered along the way. This treasure was protected by museum curators during World War II. And one of these curators was Wilhelm Unbesacht. When I then looked at his history, and there was very little to go on at that time to discover who he was, there was a tidbit there that said he was a Nazi and he was a member of the SS Ahnenerbe, which was Himmler's research institute. So I wanted to tell the story of the amazing bravery of the museum curators across Berlin with all their national treasures, protecting them. But finding out about this Ahnenerbe connection then took me down a different pathway where I was looking at how prehistorians were warping and weaponizing history to promote the Aryan myth. I'll just preface this and say that Unbesacht was not one of these radicals at all. He was a very well-established and eminent prehistorian, but he did make a deal with the devil in order to protect himself. He was being attacked by rivals, and his museum was also being attacked. And so he decided to go to Himmler's institute to get that protection.
Elisabeth, what I found fascinating was that realisation that I had when I was reading about the two schools of thought. Anyone who knows anything about the World War knows that there was that internal propaganda, but its influence on science and archaeology and essentially rewriting history was very influential, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really astounded me as well. I had no idea about this research institute, but Himmler was a bit of an evil genius, to put it mildly. He had a complete worldview. He had a playbook that he was trying to establish that the Aryan race were the master race, and in order to underpin that belief, he ensured that school children and the German populace were indoctrinated with the concept of the Aryan myth. And in order to give it a degree of respectability or authenticity, he also had prehistorians propose the concept that all great civilizations were seeded from proto-Aryans who had survived the sinking of Atlantis. And further on from that, they then ended up being the pre-Indo-European race that rose up in the Scandinavian and northern Germanic areas, and then they spread their influence across Europe. And ultimately, the argument was that Germany was entitled to take back all of that Europe, particularly the Eastern European areas, as ancestral lands because, way back in time, the Aryan race controlled that area.
That's the importance of writing stories, reminding people of the insipid and controlling influence that the Nazis had and that regime had on its thought within Germany. The characters that you've wrought throughout this really demonstrate that, because the story sort of sits with its protagonist, Freya, and her family as well. And they're German Berliners. They are considered to be of the Aryan race, so they are within the system, but the different experiences that each of those members of the family have in their interactions with the SS are very interesting. Maybe you can talk with me a bit about each of those characters.
Yes, this book is examining through one fractured German family the pull and the horror of Nazi ideology. When I researched this and made a decision to write this book from the viewpoint of German civilians, I really had to grapple with whether or not they were victims or perpetrators. There are all various theories about how you can classify the Germans at that time. But I really thought you can't approach them as a monolith. So I looked at the background to how the Nazis came to power, and it certainly didn't happen in a vacuum. A lot of what we're seeing with the pull towards right-wing ideology and authoritarianism now, it was happening after World War One with a sense of grievance. There was a lot of grievance politics going on. The Germans certainly had suffered a lot after World War One. They had to pay massive war reparations. Their industrial heartlands were taken away. And areas that they believed was theirs, which they actually had ruled for centuries, that is Poland and parts of Russia, had been taken and given back to Poland to be a sovereign state. And they really, really felt that those borderlands had been taken from them. So Hitler and the National Socialists came along and they fed into this grievance, and they said they would make Germany great again, and they would take back the borderlands, and they would also make social welfare reforms for good, valuable Germans, in other words, the Aryans. So the family that I create is Konrad Bremer, who's the father. He's a disabled veteran of World War One. He has come back from the war severely disabled, burned terribly, lost his arm. He has every reason in the world to support Hitler because veterans were given welfare through the National Socialist system. But he is a very staunch Christian and actually is part of an underground resistance church movement. So I see him as the moral compass within the family, which is establishing what we, the reader, would see as absolutely horrendous about the Nazi regime. Then we have his wife, Else, who has had to be the breadwinner throughout the war. She has two daughters. She has to work in a factory. Then her husband comes home and she has to continue to be the breadwinner. And she really sees Hitler as the ideal man who is going to come along and really assist Germans to be part of a national community and be proud. Then we have Fabl, the sister, who is an absolute fanatic. She has also had to go out, away from the family at home, away from Konrad's moral compass, and she has come into contact with very, very fanatical Nazi dogma, and she really is seduced, as many of those young Germans were, with the concept of they were the masters of the world, basically, and that they needed to breed lots more Aryans. So she goes into a program, again, masterminded by Himmler, called the SS Lebensborn movement. And then we have Freya, who has lived with Konrad throughout her schooling. She has not had to go out to work. She has had the influence of her grandparents who have read foreign books, but she has been indoctrinated in her teenage years into Nazi ideology. In 1933, the Nazis basically came in and only hired Nazi teachers. Anyone who wasn't a Nazi was sacked. And the curriculum was very, very limited and so warped. So I had to really grapple with making Freya a child of the Reich, but she does have this chink through her father to start being able to question the Nazi dogma, and this particularly comes to the fore when she meets Aryan, who is an archaeologist at the museum. She works for Dr. Umbasa at the Pre- and Early History Museum, and he is German, but a Cambridge-educated prehistorian. He just opens her eyes to the lies and fables of the regime.
couple of years ago when it was in the Academy Award running, I watched The Zone of Interest, which does that same thing as you've done here with this book, which is takes you inside Nazi Germany from that perspective of people who were part of it. And I find it fascinating because within that bubble, that experience, it's so powerful. The thing that I really found interesting with Freya is that the conversations that people have and where she's looking over her shoulder, so she's clearly got that experience of life as a young Nazi within that environment. And so whenever someone like Dr. Lessing speaks, she looks over her shoulder and it's like, oh no, who's listening? Who's going to tell on us? But is curious because there's that realisation that there's a world outside as well.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, that Zone of Interest, that was a fabulous movie.
Yes.
And there was a lot in it that really resonated with me. So the Nazi dream, the utopia, quickly went into a reign of terror. And the Gestapo, there was denunciations. Freya, the first chapter of the book, she comes along and finds her young neighbour's been beaten up by the Gestapo for playing jazz records due to someone informing on him. So the entire world was dominated by propaganda. There was no foreign newspapers. Any subversive literature was banned or burned. The radio, basically, they tried to limit it to local frequencies so that you were only listening to what was the German viewpoint, the Nazi viewpoint. So they weren't hearing that Germany was being the aggressor in Poland. They only are ever fed the Nazi viewpoint. And I really wanted to show that through Freya, that she's just taking for granted all that's being fed to her and is amazed but also perturbed when Aryan Lessing is giving her a little viewpoint into the wider world.
Yeah, and throughout the book, that egg cracks open wider and wider. Her love interest, Caspar Voigt, starts to go out as a member of the Aryan, and they're essentially pillaging, not protecting Jewish artefacts for the future, but moving them so that they become sort of part of the German cachet, and word starts to have things tick into her mind. It's like Otto von Erbach comes back and says he's getting tired of controlling the children, and it starts to ring bells in her mind in that, I guess, the extent of atrocities and the Germans can be the aggressors in that situation. The way that it's very confronting for someone living in that regime as they start to realise, I think that it's a really interesting journey.
Even thinking anything that was not the party line was dangerous. That's why she's looking over her shoulder. To have a conversation out loud in a public place or even within a private place because they were denunciating each other. So just to explain Caspar Voigt, he is one of these scientists that are sent to Tibet to find evidence of traces of Proto-Aryans who have survived Atlantis. And he's very sexy and very rich and very famous at that time, and so she is seduced by him. He's a SS officer with the Aryan, but she ends up getting trapped into marriage with him. She realises that he has a very dark side and he wants to inform on Conrad. So she protects her father by marrying this SS scientist. And through overhearing his kind of conversations or conversing with him, his conversations with other SS characters, she starts to hear these stories that are coming back from the East, from Poland and also from Ukraine. And in Poland, the SS Lebensborn, which I mentioned, they were set up to basically promote women having Aryan children. But when the war started, the pace of bearing these children was slowed. So the SS started to kidnap Polish children who had sufficient Aryan markers in order to bring them into the Lebensborn. So Otto, the character, he's involved in the SS Lebensborn, and so does Vola. Her sister also becomes involved with it. And Freya is constantly being confronted with the fact that she's actually dealing with criminals. There's criminal behaviour going on, and that the history that she's been taught has been subverted in order to justify dispossession and kidnap and and conquest and ultimately genocide.
The interesting thing, though, is that within Germany at the time, it wasn't considered criminal because it was justified in its weird and horrific way.
Yes, one of the things that came across from reading about the German people is that there was endemic anti-Semitism that can't be shied away
No.
from. And there was also really very anti-Slavic people. So when Poland was invaded and the Jews were starting to be oppressed, there was a certain degree of kind of, turning their face away from it, covering their eyes, or they were applauding it. So what I saw is that there were different levels of complicity and culpability, but there was also complacency, and that complacency, that disinterest, that inability to actually engage with what was happening ended up in the whole Nazi oppression or war crimes occurring. But not all of them knew the full details of what was happening in the East in particular, but they certainly would have seen by the 1943 the Jews were being eradicated out. They were being transferred out of Berlin, and they were being shipped out in freight trains going from suburban Berlin rail stations. So the German people would have been aware that the Jews were being sent out of various German cities, but they would have seen them going to work camps. The extent of the extermination camps was something that probably wasn't known by a lot of them until after the war ended.
What is it that makes you turn to this part of history? I read in your acknowledgements that you were sort of told by publishers that World War II is over, that these stories have been told, and yet I feel like they're very salient stories and probably need to be retold, especially in times like this. What was it that made you turn your gaze to this time and this place?
I wrote it 10 years, and it came from a bottom drawer novel, actually, that I started writing 30 years ago. It's showing my age. So it wasn't a case of me wanting to suddenly turn to World War II because it was a trend and it took me too long to write about it. It was because I really became fascinated with Priam's treasure and what had happened to it in Germany, and ultimately how it ended up in Soviet hands. This is something with historical fiction. I don't think you should write to trends. I think you should write to what you are passionate about. So this story is where my passion lay for 10 years. And unfortunately, by the time I finished it and had it ready, I was told by the publishers that World War II was over.
That's astonishing.
Yes. But luckily I found one publisher in the UK and Linda Audio that said it wasn't over.
I'm glad you persevered. And I just find it fascinating. I love understanding where people get the inspiration for a story, because the whole world that you've explored here, that story of the treasures of Troy and its discovery, that's a thread through it, but the worlds within it are sort of what sustain the book as well. Tell me a bit more about the treasures, because I think that was another insight here, was just the extent to which these museums went to protect these through such a turbulent time.
Yes, the Museum of Pre and Early History, their jewel in the crown was Priam's treasure that was found by Schliemann at Troy, and he had a very fanciful way. He thought he'd found Homeric Troy, but he hadn't. It was 1,000 years earlier. And it's these beautiful jewels that he had his young wife, who's 30 years younger than him, wear and be photographed with. And so they really have caught the imagination of people for a long time. It went around the world as an amazing discovery. There were also other hoards of gold held there, and this metope of Apollo, the sun god, rising up on a chariot of 4 horses, which Unversagt really wanted to protect as well, a massive monument. Across Berlin at that time, all of the national cultural institutions were madly trying to protect their priceless items. And by the end of the war, the RAF and the Americans were bombing Berlin twice daily. So the RAF would bomb in the morning and the US would bomb at night. And these museum curators were at great risk, continued to hack their exhibits, and they ended up in a massive black tower, which is like a 6-story high concrete fortress in the zoo. It was created as an air raid shelter for about 15,000 people. It ended up 30,000 people being crammed in there in the fall of Berlin. And it also had massive anti-flak guns that would fire off against the enemy airplanes. The story of how these curators protected their priceless items, I've discovered kind of the nuts and bolts of it through Unversach's day journals and also from an amazing article that his wife wrote. He married her after the war and she wrote it after he had died, actually, and it came out in 1989 around the time that the wall came down.
It's amazing what extents people go to for the things that they're passionate about in life and the things that are valued through everything else and all the turmoil that's going on. It's no wonder that was the captivating story for you to follow.
I was really fascinated by the moral choices. Like, these curators were, particular Unversach was put into this crucible of physical danger, but also ethical conflict. You know, he was involved with trying to protect his museum, but he's getting the patronage of very evil people like Goering and Himmler. And Freya herself has to also deal with her husband and being an SS wife, even though she is trying to find out what Casper's research involves. So it's racial studies research and it's very, very dark. And she has to deal with the ethics of being within his world. She's trapped in it, but she has to appear to be with that world in order to not herself be executed. I really like looking at putting people into pressure cooker environments and having to deal with moral conflict.
Elisabeth Storrs, she's the author of Fables and Lies, which is out now, and I highly recommend it. Get your hands on it. You'll be in for a while, but it's absolutely gripping from page to page.
And we love being immersed, don't we?
Absolutely.
And have we been immersed? What have you been reading?
I've read a book that if you saw the name, you probably wouldn't go, oh, that sounds appealing, because it's called On the Calculation of Volume. It's by an author called Sauvage Bowles. It's a translation. An amazing book. It's really captivating, and it's hard to explain why, but basically it's set around the experience of this woman, Tara, and she's stuck on the 18th of November. She wakes up in the morning, she goes through her day, and at the end of night, she goes to bed and she wakes up again on the same day, stuck in a loop. And it's really fascinating because it starts with obviously her making sense of it, understanding that, you know, that she's picking up the paper and it's the same day again. It then expands to her realising that impacts her relationships, her partner and her, like what she can do and can't do in terms of interacting with him. She does get to a point where she tells him about it. She says, look, I'm stuck in this day, so I know you've woken up today thinking it's fresh and new and you'll move on tomorrow, but me, I'm reliving this day every day.
Sounds
and
horrible.
It's how they explore it together and try and make sense of it, try and break it and all of those sorts of things. And then it progresses over time into then what decisions she has to make to keep herself sane, to keep herself living within this space and to not impact the lives of those who she interacts with. And so it's a bizarrely captivating story. It's not as dystopian as you sort of think from the outside in when I describe it, you know, because she's very creative and thoughtful about the way that she tries to approach each day and the things that she does. The weird thing is it is a multi-volume book. So I've read parts 1 and part 2 and it just progresses. And, you know, you live in hope that she will one day work out what the formula is to
Oh dear.
escape this day, but also in living in the day, she's doing pretty well. So, as I say, it's a very unusual concept for a book, but one that
But readable.
I read book one and I couldn't wait to pick up the second one. That's how engaging it is. So, On the Calculation of Volume by Solveig Balls.
Right. Well, I'm going to give a big plug to Lily King's Heart the Lover, which is doing the rounds at the moment. Yeah. You've read it as well, Sarah. Oh, what a book. A young woman at college, deeply entrenched in the literary world, and she meets a couple of cool guys who are equally interested in talking late into the night about writing and philosophy, but also have a raucously good time. One becomes her first love, and it's an absolute roller coaster of an affair, you would agree?
Yes.
And we never quite understand why it ended, because we re-meet her in middle age, and after that it just get the tissues out. She is forced to confront her past, and you end up with this trio of middle-aged people dealing with what happened a long time ago. Heart-wrenchingly sad, but absolutely beautiful book.
I loved the language in it. The story itself was quite compelling. It feels like it sort of touched a little bit on the sense of the secret history. It wasn't quite as dark as that book, but it sort of captivated that college time, those relationships, those young lives, but then the reflection on those young lives as these people grew older, and the heartbreak. But also just the way things were written. There were sentences that I read over and over again throughout it, just because it was really beautiful, beautiful writing.
Absolutely beautiful book, yeah. And I also read, I think I've talked about this before, Euphoria, which she wrote about 12 years ago, which is set in PNG, a completely different kind of book. Once again, a love triangle, but just such a good read.
Right.
So, yeah, she's an extremely interesting writer. And, you know, reading about a love story that really touches a chord for everybody. It's about sliding doors, about what might have been. Amazing. Heart the Lover by Lily King.
That's it for Sundoku today, and thank you so much for tuning in again. Thanks to, of course, to the lovely authors that have given up their time to have a chat to us today. We hope you really enjoyed those conversations.
We loved meeting Michael Caleb Tasker and Elisabeth Storrs.
Oh, absolutely. And we hope that you're loving what you're hearing. Really makes a difference to us if you can give us a review or, you know, give us 5 stars. Let other people know. Put Sundoku in their ears because hopefully if you're like what you're hearing, then others will too.
You can contact us on sundokukast@gmail.com.
And you can find us online on Instagram and Facebook at Sundoku.
Time for us to go, Sarah.
Yeah, it is. Thanks very much.
Thanks
Bye.
for listening. Bye-bye.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally, Michaela Andreev,
Annie Hastwell.
And me, Sarah Martin. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Sundokukast, TSUNDOKU cast.